On August 9, 1978, Olympic Airlines Flight 411, a Boeing 747-200, faced a challenging situation. With a catastrophic engine failure during takeoff from Athens to New York, the crew fought to keep the plane airborne. So how did Captain Migadis and his crew deal with this situation, and were they able to avoid disaster? Let's find out. In 1957, Greek shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis acquired TAE Greek National Airlines and established Olympic Airways. Initially offering domestic and international flights, Olympic Airways became Greece's national carrier, significantly impacting the country's aviation history. The airline modernized its fleet in the 1960s and 1970s, introducing Comet 4B jets and launching long-haul services in 1966 with routes from Athens to New York using Boeing 707-320s. Olympic Airways acquired the Boeing 747-200s in 1976 and introduced Olympic catering. In 2009, the Greek state sold most of Olympic Airways operations to the Martin Investment Group, privatizing it as Olympic Air. Introduced in 1971, the Boeing 747-200 was an enhanced version of the original 747, featuring more powerful engines, greater fuel efficiency, extended range, and a distinctive humped upper deck. Developed in response to Pan Am's demand for a larger jetliner, the 747-200 supported higher takeoff weights and increased payload capacity, making it ideal for long-haul flights. The 747-200 series included variants like the 747-200F cargo freighter and the 747-200B, used as Air Force One. Its versatility and performance solidified the 747-200's role as a pivotal aircraft in commercial aviation. Now on to Flight 411. The incident took place on the 9th of August, 1978. At the time, Olympic Airways was state-owned by the Greek government. Shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis sold his stake in the company after his son died in an aviation accident in 1973. The Queen of the Skies, the Boeing 747-200, was featured on Olympic Airways' most prestigious route, a direct flight from Athens to New York. The Olympic Zeus was the first Boeing 747 that Olympic Airways commissioned from Boeing. At the time, the main airport of Athens was Ellinikon International Airport, which had 3 parallel runways. Runway 33 on the right, runway 15 on the left, and the third one was mainly used as a taxiway. The second runway was also primarily used as a taxiway for Olympic Airways planes, which had their dedicated building in the southern part of the airport. On August 9th, it was incredibly hot, about 43 degrees Celsius. In Athens, when it's that hot, there's usually a breeze coming from the northwest or west, which was true on that day too. The main runway, runway 33 right, pointed straight towards downtown Athens. Because of that, planes had to quickly turn left after taking off to avoid making too much noise over the city. Now what we need to understand is that Athens is locally known as Lacanopedio, which would translate to wash basin in English. The reason is that Athens is surrounded by fairly high ground on 3 of its sides. The only escape route to avoid this terrain is the sea, which is located on the southwest to the west side. These topography details are really important for the Olympic Zeus. In charge of this very aircraft was a highly skilled ex-militant pilot, Captain Migadis, accompanied by his close friend First Officer Kostos Fikardos and a flight engineer named Tribos. The Boeing 747-200 has 4 big Pratt & Whitney JT9D/7A engines. Usually, each engine can make 46,150 pounds of thrust. However, on August 9th, engine number 2 had undergone some repairs. As a result, it was only supposed to operate at 96% of its normal power instead of at full capacity. Now keep in mind that this was a fully loaded flight with mainly American tourists returning to New York. Also, the flight was very long, which meant the plane was carrying almost 140 tons of fuel on board. So it was really heavy, and the fact that the outside temperatures were really hot, this aircraft needed all of its available thrust for takeoff. The Pratt & Whitney engines had a clever feature. Normally, the engine's power is limited by how hot it gets inside. If you put too much fuel in, it gets too hot and can damage parts. But these engines had a trick. They could spray a mix of water and glycol just before the fuel burns. This cools down the flame, letting the engine use more fuel and make more power. With this cooling and more fuel, the engines could make 110% of their usual power, so instead of 46,150 pounds of thrust, they could make 47,670 pounds of thrust. That's a significant increase, but there were downsides. When you spray water and glycol like this, some fuel doesn't burn properly and just gets pushed out of the engine. The 747-200 was not the only aircraft that used this feature. The B-52 bomber also used this for takeoff. This could be seen in huge black plumes that came behind them, which of course isn't very environmentally friendly. On top of this, you had to carry the weight of the water glycol mixture, so you had to calculate whether it was worth it to carry the extra weight. This water glycol mixture was stored in 2 tanks placed just behind the landing gears, weighing about 2,300 kilos each. This would last about 2.5 minutes, and during these 2.5 minutes, you would get extra thrust. But after that, you had to be very quick to reduce the thrust back again, so you wouldn't damage the engines. The system worked as follows. The flight engineer on board was responsible for activating it during taxi, just before the aircraft entered the runway. He would switch on the pumps, which would initially trigger a couple of low-pressure lights. These lights would extinguish once the water pressure was correct, resulting in 4 green lights that indicated the system was ready. A common issue with this process was that during shutdown phases, the shutoff valves inside the engines often wouldn't close completely, so that when the flight engineer activated the system, the pumps would start producing pressure, and since the valves were still a little bit open, the full water pressure would just go straight into the engine, and this would cause something called a steam out or a piss out, where the engine would just shut down. The system would have to be turned off, and then that engine had to be restarted again. If the system worked properly, well, then the system would be armed as the pilot would set takeoff thrust. When the thrust reached 1.25 points of the engine pressure ratio, or EPR for short, the valves would open, allowing the introduction of the water glycol mixture, thereby providing extra thrust. The pilots would increase the engine power more than usual during takeoff. They had to watch the exhaust gas temperature closely. If a water pump failed while they were taking off, the engine would still be set to use more power with water cooling, but without the water, the engine could fail fast. So this complex system needed careful watching. It wasn't used a lot, so the crews weren't very used to it. On Flight 411, some reports suggest that the flight engineer might have mistakenly switched off the system during takeoff, but this was unlikely because the pilots would have seen a green indicator showing that the system was operational. What was more likely was that one of the pumps failed during takeoff, causing the subsequent failure. Anyway, just before 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 9th of August, Olympic Airways Flight 411 started its takeoff roll. On board the aircraft, there were 398 passengers and 20 crew members, making it a total of 418 people. Captain Migadis was the pilot flying, and he would have told his flight engineer to activate the water glycol system while they were taking off, and the aircraft started to accelerate down the runway. It passed its V1 speed, which was the decision speed. It reached its rotation speed, and the captain started rotating when a catastrophic failure occurred to engine number 3. The failure was so violent that the engine started to disintegrate, and some parts of it fell on the runway and some on the houses in the direction of departure. Captain Migadis is now trying to get this gigantic plane airborne without the thrust on engine number 3, which has just failed, and engine number 2 running at reduced thrust after its previous maintenance. Now, there wasn't much thrust to begin with here because of the very high outdoor temperature and high weight, which was why they were using the water glycol mixture in the first place. Now, as he was rotating, he called his flight engineer to confirm whether the water glycol system was activated or not. At this moment, due to the confusion and panic, it's likely that instead of making sure the switch was on, he did the opposite and turned the switch off instead. This further reduced the available thrust, and now the aircraft could barely fly. Captain Migadis barely managed to get the aircraft to climb slightly and managed to just skim over the 12-foot-high airport fence, and now he was flying towards downtown Athens. The next thing the pilot asked for was to gear up. First Officer Fikardos, who's helping with the controls, pauses before lifting the landing gear as advised by Boeing. Why? Because during gear retraction on a Boeing 747, there's a 15-second period where the gear doors must open, creating extra drag that might stall the plane. But when landing gears fully retract and the gear doors close, this reduces the overall drag of the airplane. Hence, it was a risky move to retract the gears, but a necessary one. Fikardos hesitates for a moment, then follows the captain's order to raise the gear. Despite some tense moments, the plane managed to stay in the air, but there were still more problems to deal with. They are now only skimming the rooftops of central Athens, actually blowing off a few TV antennas on some of the tall buildings. Captain Migadis knows that about 1 mile in sight, there's a hill on central downtown Athens called Pani Hill, and he needs to get his plane up high enough for it to pass over the hill. In this situation, one might ask, well, why wasn't he turning left or right? Well, his speed was now much lower than it should be. His safe climb-out speed was 180 knots, and now they were closer to 170 and the speed was still reducing. Moreover, Captain Migadis knew that if he started to maneuver the aircraft and started turning, well, then his lift would reduce even further, and it was very likely that his aircraft would stall straight into downtown Athens. So instead, he continued to climb on straight ahead. He saw the hill coming up ahead of him. The aircraft was still not accelerating, and Captain Migadis had no choice but to gently pull back on his yoke and sacrifice a few knots to gain those precious 200 feet of altitude in that mile to fly over Panny Hill. He managed to do this with only 9 feet to spare. That's 3 meters over the top of the hill. The controllers in the air traffic control tower were looking helplessly at the aircraft headed towards the Panny Hill, skimming through the rooftops of Athens. They thought that the aircraft was certainly going to crash into the hill, but they were relieved to see that it managed to climb slightly over it. In the cockpit, it was now very quiet as all 3 pilots were fairly convinced that the plane was certainly going to crash, but they were well determined to prevent this from happening. As Captain Migadis got to the other side of Panny Hill, the terrain started to drop off and he now felt he could sacrifice a little bit of his altitude to gain a few knots. So he dropped his nose, and from 209 feet of indicated altitude, he dropped down to 157 feet, but the fact was that they were still not accelerating. The aircraft continued to drop airspeed and it got as low as 164 knots, which was well below the stall speed with the current configuration of the airplane. So how come the aircraft was not stalling then? Well, likely they're probably in the ground effect. The ground effect is something that happens to an aircraft when it flies within half of its wingspan away from the ground. When it does this, the ground effect will stop some of the downflow from the wings, and it will also hinder some of the wingtip vortices from forming. Together, this means that the aircraft gets a little bit more lift than it would with the same angle of attack, not to mention it has less drag. So this was likely what was keeping the aircraft airborne, but the pilots knew that if the speed were to drop more, they would eventually crash. Now the first thing they were looking for was a football stadium. If they were to crash land the plane down there, it would create less havoc and collateral damage than in the surrounding streets, which were full of houses. This was again possible if there was no football match going on in the desired stadium. Another option was to try to reach the Agalio Mountains, which were on the far side of Athens. If they do that, there are almost no buildings around it, which means minimum collateral damage. A crash landing was the best option because if they were able to achieve that, there was also a high likelihood that some of the crew and passengers might survive. So this was now the goal of the pilots. They kept flying at an extremely low altitude, so low that when they passed the Inter-American Tower, which is a 14-story building in downtown Athens, they were flying at the same altitude as that building's height. Some of the flight attendants later told the press that they were so close to this building that they could look in and see the faces of the people inside. The flight attendants, by the way, had also noticed that something was wrong. Some of the flight attendants seated in the back of the cabin had seen the catastrophic failure of the number 3 engine, and they called up their purser in the front saying, "I think we're screwed." And the purser just responded with, "Yeah, I know." But they kept their composure. They were looking so calm during this fiasco that the passengers around them didn't realize that something was wrong, and some of them were taking pictures as this was happening. The aircraft has now been flying for about 90 seconds, and now 3 things are going to happen. First, the aircraft now flies outside the most densely populated areas of Athens. City centers typically experience higher temperatures, so as the aircraft moves away from the zone, the temperature drops from about 43 Celsius to around 38 Celsius, providing extra thrust to the engines. Additionally, they were entering an area where the winds were picking up and turning slightly northerly, resulting in more headwinds, which further boosted engine thrust. Finally, the flight engineer manages to get the water glycol system working again, or at least that's what we infer, as the engine suddenly started producing more thrust. These factors combined to accelerate the aircraft from speeds as low as 164 knots to 160 knots according to the data recorder, up to 180 knots, which was the safe climb speed. When this happened, Captain Migadis started to ease back a little bit on his yoke, getting the aircraft climbing, but he knew that with this, he wouldn't be able to get over the mountains. But at this airspeed, Captain Migadis now realized that he had enough altitude to start to slightly maneuver the aircraft first northwest and then westwards following a small valley out towards the sea. This was a glimmer of hope for the pilots to land the plane safely instead of crash landing it. Once the plane was over the sea, it gained enough altitude for the pilot to start retracting its flaps. He did so after climbing 300 feet. Over the Bay Area, the pilot decided to start dumping the fuel. This was to land the airplane safely. They dumped the fuel for about 30 minutes before they arrived back to land on the same runway from which they took off. The aircraft was still slightly overweight when they landed, but thankfully they landed safely. Everyone on board was safe. The aircraft taxied back into the terminal, they disembarked the aircraft, and Captain Migadis was surprised to learn that his 2 daughters had been called there. This was because the traffic controllers saw the aircraft disappearing beyond Panny Hill, so they sent out a message that the aircraft was likely about to crash. His daughters heard this message and came to the airport. Furthermore, according to the local media reports, Captain Migadis then went into another 747 and took off towards New York that very same evening. Unfortunately, we weren't able to accurately verify this, so take this with a grain of salt. Moreover, as it was back in 1978 when this data of the incident was sent to Boeing, Boeing initially did not believe it because they said that at those speeds, the plane should have crashed. They tried to replicate the scenario in a simulator multiple times, and every time the plane would crash. Another reason that there is no final report could have been that Greece did not have an independent investigation service like the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB for short, in the United States. After that, they established an independent investigation service. Olympic Airways Flight 411 was a testament to its crew's training and experience, especially to the captain's, Captain Migadis' ability to remain calm and react professionally in a situation that had never before occurred and could have killed everybody on board. The incident of the 9th of August 1978 showcases the technical, environmental, and human aspects that are always present when things go wrong in aviation but could have ended in disaster. The crew reacted promptly and maintained their composure while they maneuvered the large jet over the densely populated downtown Athens, Greece. The incident underscored the need for extensive training of the crews to unforeseen situations and the adaptations to the changing emergency thresholds, as well as the improvements in the aviation safety standards. Most importantly, it demonstrated the need for an independent investigative body to analyze such incidents in the future. The crew of Flight 411 etched themselves into aviation history as normal people who did the extraordinary by responding to an incident that had all the ingredients to end up in a major catastrophe, but turned a sure loss of lives into a successful emergency landing, which to this day is used as an example in aviation safety and crisis management courses. Well, that will be it for today's video. Share your thoughts about today's video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new updates. As always, take care, and we'll see you all in the next one.